Greetings, Acolyte, and welcome back to the Ordo Grigio, the Emperor's secret society against the enemy that is unpainted models. Today we paint a Traitor Salamander champion that I 3D printed for less than £1. So while I layer on some Daemonic yellow onto the base, let's get into the why I'm doing what I'm doing. Viewers who have seen my other videos have probably worked out that I'm a fan of the Dornian Heresy, having a small Nurgle Blood Angels and an Iron Warriors force that I made up out of rescued miniatures from boxes I've had for years, and for hitting over 100 subs I wanted to do a more dramatic model following that theme, but that was painted a little bit different than my usual style, which leads us to this model. Now, being a salamander originating from the volcanic world of Nocturne, I just had to have some sort of lava on the base, which is why I'm painting the yellow into the deep cracks of the base, and we will work up from there. The black prime here wasn't the best idea, as covering black with yellow takes quite a few layers. However, I'm a fan of the durability of my polyurethane primer, so a few extra layers it is. Once the layers are done and dry, it's time for a dry brush of Wild Rider Red from Citadel. As you can see, I'm working the paint into the bristle of a cheap makeup brush and working it back and forth across the base, aiming to hit about 60 to 70% of the texture. It's maybe my third lava base I've ever done, and I'm mostly winging it at this point, to be honest. But sometimes you just gotta try something new, right? I'll repeat this with Mechrite Red, but reducing the coverage to maybe 40 to 50%. By starting with the lightest yellow and working down the colours, it gives the impression that the deepest cracks are the hottest and most fluid parts of the lava, with it cooling and crusting as it gets closer to the surface. Though it did mess with my brain a little bit, doing the colours the quote-unquote wrong way round. Once the red dries, matte black from the army painter comes out, and we do another dry brush. Here we're looking to just catch the tips and the flat spots of the base, where the magma has cooled sufficiently to start becoming rock again. I was a little enthusiastic with the cleaning of my brush in between steps here, and it resulted in the paint being a bit wet for my taste, though it did actually help that transition of the colours, so we'll just call it a happy little accident. At this point in the paint, I still didn't really know how much work I had left in front of me, so I was pretty naive in thinking I'd get this model done in a night or two. I learnt otherwise. While I had the black out, I also tidied up the rim of the base to save me coming back in later when the model is finished, and added a few more areas of black to the larger, cooler rocks. There wasn't really a deep methodology to what rocks I picked, I was just going by feel. The rocks were looking a little bit flat though, so I got Mechanicus Standard Grey out for a very light dry brush across all the rocks, just to add in a slight bit of texture to them and a little highlight. I know in real lava the glow from the lava kind of blows out this highlight, but it didn't look right without it in my opinion. You may think differently though. Once this dried, I applied some matte varnish to protect it and could move on to the other half of the base, the Dead Space Marine. Screamer Pink is used for the base of this Marine, and I painted this all over the areas of the armour, including the shoulder pads, even though later they'd be getting painted differently. When deciding what colours I wanted to do the Dead Marine in, I based it on two factors: what would stand out from the green of the Salamander, and who I would want the Salamander to be fighting. There's actually surprisingly little lore for the Salamanders in the Dornian Heresy, which is one of the reasons I chose them. There's a lot of room for creativity. They share similarities with the Iron Warriors in that they are expert craftsmen and fairly utilitarian, so what better adversary than the overly stylised and pompous Emperor's Children, though I haven't ever painted a non-Slaanesh Emperor's Child before. So two new Dornian Heresy schemes in one video, even if one is an obstacle in a demonic game of the floor is lava. After applying a few thin layers and letting them dry, I shade the army with Druchii Violet, essentially following the same scheme I used on the cloaks for the Iron Warriors Warsmiths in a previous video. Since I first started experimenting with using washes of the same colour as the base colour, I actually really like how it turns out. It kind of moves it away from the dark gritty style I'm used to, and the finished model is a bit more vibrant in the end. though I admit this is a lot of work for a dead body on a base. Once dry, I came back in with thin layers of Screamer Pink to re-establish the mid-tone of the model and remove any patchiness from the wash. Though I'm leaving the shade in the recesses and focusing more on the shapes and volumes of the armour than building towards the edges. I've seen volumetric highlighting a lot on YouTube and other sources and wanted to give it a really good go on this model, as a sort of mini diorama which likely won't ever be used in a game. Maybe I'll do more like this when I hit milestones on the channel, and reflect the milestones in the budget, who knows. Using the paint this thin allows me to do multiple layers on the go, moving each layer more towards the centre of each shape, building up a transition from the darkest shadows to the highlights. And luckily it dries pretty quick, so in one pass you can get a couple of layers on there, speeding up what is quite a time intensive process, though it does bump the contrast quite a bit for the end result. Celestra Grey next for all the areas I want to be white on the dead marine, such as the shoulder pads and kneecaps. I'm starting with an off-white grey, so I can build up to a white using the same method as I used on the purple of the armour. A layer or two of base, apply a wash, re-establish midtones, and then a highlight. At this point, I have to say, I hate painting white. Fair play to my mate Bruce, who paints a lot of white and light grey models. I don't have the patience for that. Before going further with washes though, Retributor armour comes out for all the metallics on the Emperor's Child. I was basing my scheme off some artwork I saw, and the model had the grille of its helmet in gold, so I decided to replicate this. Even though it was just a corpse on the base, I wanted it to feel like the pompous, arrogant, "Ooh, look at me" Marines that I see them as, so purple, whites and golds it is. I also wanted to get all the base colours in before I started going deep into the wash and highlight land, in case I made any mistakes. It's much easier to clean up one layer of paint than several layers, shades and highlights. Speaking of washes, Nuln Oil is next to shade the greys and the gold. I manipulated the wash a little bit on the shoulder pads, encouraging it to pool where would be underneath the model, to get a really deep shadow on the rounded pauldrons, and mostly just focused on avoiding getting black wash onto the purple and making sure I had a nice panel line between the white and the gold. The final step for night 1 was to go back in with the Celestia Grey, thinned on the pot rim because I'm lazy, and re-establish the off-white. I didn't really thin it enough though on the first attempt and tried to come back in with water to soften it up. However, this left a horrible patchy mess in the middle. Sometimes you make mistakes in painting, but it's only paint. Let it dry and come back to it later on. Day 2 starts with matte white from the Army Painter, focused more onto the inner edges of the top of the shoulder pads, which you can see I did go back in and fix the blotchy mess I made. Still, it's not the best, and I do end up redoing one of the shoulder pads afterwards, but this is a model I wanted to push my boundaries on, even if it's not my best painting in the end. I'll know more about painting when the model's complete than at the start, sometimes that's the win. Before going further, I use green skin from Army Painter for the lenses of the eyes on the dead marine. A bit nerve-wracking when you have unstable hands at best, and a few highlights in the area around it, which is why the little brush came out. The final step for the armour is to mix Pink Horror and Screamer Pink, roughly 50-50, for the final highlights on the armour. Even though I have a palette right next to me, I've started using 3D printed bases to mix colours in. I don't know why, but they're handy. These highlights with the mix are much more focused than before, hitting the centre of shapes and the highest points. Mixing in the Pink Horror really makes this step pop, especially with that gradient all the way down to a dark purple in the shadows. I give the model 2 passes of translucent pink to really bump up the contrast as much as I can, while it still reads as purple rather than a dark pink. A Dornian camo shade is the last step on the Dead Emperor's Child, adding just a dab of this to the eye lenses just to give them some depth. Though I did apply a little too much, so after a quick wicking away of excess wash, I can let it dry and attach the model to its base. Finishing night 2 looking a little something like this. though I did have to stop myself getting too carried away and trying to do a red-yellow underglow across the entire model. Maybe one day. Night 3 starts with Mechanicus Standard Grey, finally starting on the Salamander. I use this colour for all the piping and armour ribbing on the model. I figured I should probably get this colour in there, while it doesn't really matter if I go over the lines or not, with some of these areas being the deepest part of the model. I think in total I used maybe 7 different packs of 3D printing files to create this guy, and it took about an entire evening to design him. I wanted something recognisable as both a Salamander and a Chaos Space Marine, so a flamer was entirely necessary. Salamanders are known to be great artisans, so I felt they would be one of the few Chaos factions to genuinely look after their gear, and would likely not willingly invite mutation. So I kept the model fairly clean when deciding on parts, though I did use Chaos components to get the extra banding and the shoulder pads Chaos Forces are known for. Matte black next for all the weapon casings and shoulder pads, carrying on the theme of tying them into their Loyalist roots. Given the Salamanders were once known for their compassion and often putting themselves into harm's way for humans, even when not tactically viable, I figured that when they turned to Chaos, they had seen the potential future of mankind, enslaved to the will of the Emperor in a galaxy-spanning dictatorship. They joined Rogel Dawn to prevent this, not knowing that it was this betrayal that started humanity on the very path they were trying to prevent. Now, 10,000 years later, they fight to free humanity from the shackles of the false Emperor by any means necessary, even if it means harnessing the powers of demons and chaos. Lead Belcher next for the metal parts of the weapons and all of the armour trims and details, including the metal crown embedded in the helmet. In the Blood Angels Raptor video I talked about how the trim could be painted before the armour, so decided to give it a try on this model. It's about 6.5 dozen to me if I'm honest, much of the same, but I did say I was going to try new things out with this model. Functionally, I think if I was to play these Salamanders in 3rd edition 40k, I'd likely use the Wordbearer's rules. Powerful orators utilising chaos demons and large amounts of troops to overwhelm enemy encampments, possibly with the demons taking on a more draconic form. Quadrupedal lizards as chaos hounds, fire-breathing drakes for horrors and flamers of Zench, or using the talons as chaos furies. I think it could be a really cool thematic army, and yep, now I want to make it, even though I already have 5 armies on the go. I need help. Anyway, Retributor armour, much like for the Emperor's Child, is painted onto the trim and areas of the metallics that I want to embellish a little, first and foremost being the 8-pointed Star of Chaos. I'm hoping that by highlighting this icon in the centre of his chest, it'll really help separate out this form from a Loyalist Salamander. The same goes for the star on his shoulder pad as well. Mechrite Red from Citadel. I have no idea how old this paint is, by the way, for the lizard skin veil he wears across his face. In the references I looked at, most of the lizard skin worn by the Salamanders was a similar dark red, though I shifted the red up slightly to imply perhaps it was from some form of demonic lizard, rather than the lizards of the homeworld Nocturne. Onto the armour, green skin from Army Painter comes out. As with the other layers, I thin this fairly heavily and begin applying this to the model. This is where the model moves from being a fire lizard lover into actually feeling like a salamander. The model was primed with a military green paint from Vallejo through the airbrush, so I made sure to leave some of this darker, less saturated green in the recesses to bump up that contrast value, even though this would still get a wash later on as well. I followed much of the same principles as I did with the Dead Space Marine on the base, focusing more on the shapes rather than edge highlighting, and I just worked my way across the model. This was probably the single step which had the biggest impact on the feel of the model, and this is where it all started coming together, even though there was still a lot of work left to do. It was only while writing this and editing it together I realised the colours I used for the Salamander's armour were the same as the Dead Marine's eyes. Another happy little accident. Much like painting white, I'm also not a fan of trying to paint black to a high standard, so Mechanicus Standard Grey comes back out to highlight all of the black areas before any washes are applied. My hope with this is that by adding a subtle highlight before the wash, when the black wash is applied it will tone down the highlight and bring it closer to the black, making it feel more natural in the end. I did do more of an edge highlight with the black on the weapons to distinguish them from the organic shapes of the armour and make them feel more solid, if that's the right word. On the Power Fist, as well as the edge highlight, I added some lighter areas to the curved surfaces to add a bit more dimension and texture on the large panels. I also added some of the highlighting to the shoulder pads, focusing it on the upper surfaces where the light would hit it the most, though I think I may have put a bit much on these in the end. Wild Rider Red is used to paint the eye lenses, a step I should have definitely done before painting the areas around them. I did initially paint a little around the lenses to try and achieve a glowing effect, though I scrapped this idea as I couldn't get it to work. I added a highlight of Mephiston Red to the Salamander's veil, also covering up the attempt at the glow, following the folds of the hide. I added this in before the washes to keep the highlight subtle, as I wasn't sure quite what wash I'd use just yet. Next is Celestra Grey for the Salamander's icon on the shoulder pad. Traditionally on Loyalist this is a white icon, but I wanted to keep it off-white to be just a little bit darker than the Loyalists, but still recognisable as the Salamander's icon. The last step before washes was Dawnstone from Citadel as a final pre-wash highlight for the black on the model. Sharper and more focused than the previous grey, hitting just the tips and the centre of the reflections I'd done on the Power Fist. Then a few touches onto the very tops of the shoulder pads to add just a little bit more depth to the highlight. The first wash was non-oil, applied to all the black, silver or grey areas, helping to add some shading and tone down the highlights on the black. This is definitely the most washes I've used on a single model, and I'm definitely enjoying the effect of using colour correct washes, though it is a pain waiting for them to dry in between steps. Agrax Earthshade next for all the brass or gold areas, such as the tip of the flamer. I don't know why, but I paint the muzzle of every flamer and melter with this Retributor armour colour. It's just how it is in my head, I guess. I also apply this onto the armour trim, and have to say, considering I scaled the Salamander up by about 10%, the details on the print still stand out very well. Once that wash dries, Athonian Camo Shade is applied across all of the green armour, bringing the green skin down and helping blend it with the military green that I left in the recesses. This also goes on to the veil to mute the red slightly and give just the subtlest hint of demonic influence. So subtle I forgot about it and couldn't tell until I saw this. Once dry we do some rapid fire highlights. Wild Rider Red for attempt 2 of the eye lenses, using a smaller brush this time. Mephiston Red for the lizard skin veil, hitting the folds and a few of the raised scales for just a little bit more depth and texture. Retributor Armour for the brass gold trim. Back to the volumes of the shapes and hitting just upper surfaces to add more reflection and shine, essentially just removing the shade we applied in select areas. Lead Belcher for much of the same, but with the silver areas, such as the tops of the flamer barrels and the banding on the fuel tank or top of the backpack connectors and joints. Plate Mail Metal for both the metallics, even more focused than the previous highlights, where just the harshest of the light and reflections would hit and would naturally desaturate the gold. This is a very easily missed step, but I think it does add a lot to the model when you hold it close and have a good look at it. Back to greenskin for one of the last highlights on the model. Thinned heavily, this goes on to the armour panels in the same way we've done before, re-establishing that mid-tone and adding more contrast to the model. As Athonian Camo Shade is quite a low pigment wash, this step is fairly subtle, but it is an important bridge between the wash and the next highlight, and for the 10 minutes it took to apply this step, it's definitely worth it for the final result. It's only recently I've actually started getting into the more vibrant colour schemes with my miniatures, mostly staying within evil or grim-dark palettes before, and I'm actually really enjoying the journey a lot. Whilst the grimdark has a real-world gritty feel to it, adding in vibrancy really makes models stand out on the tabletop, and you can do a lot more artistically with it, rather than the flatter colours, though some models will never really suit high vibrancy in my opinion. I mix in some Daemonic yellow into the green skin, not quite 50-50, but more like a 60-40 with 60 green skin, 40 Daemonic yellow, for a final couple of thin highlights to the armour. This shift in colour is why the previous step was important, as without this, it would likely be too high a jump in colour for a single step, though I suppose you could get around it with glazing the layers on if you had more patience than me at 1:30 this morning. As with all my mixed highlights, it's much more focused towards the edges of the shapes and the highest points which would receive the most light, some of them barely even being tickled with a brush before I move on. Adding the yellow into the green really pulls this into the modern Salamanders spectrum, but building it up like this leaves plenty of dark recesses to help sell this as a Chaos Space Marine. In my head anyway. Finally, I add Fire Giant Orange, a speed paint from the Army Painter, into the areas around the eyes, toning down the orange just a little bit, and one more final touch with the model, and we're left with this. So there we are, a Salamander's Chaos Space Marine charging across the demonic wasteland to liberate humanity from the shackles of the false emperor, painted in a somewhat different style than normal, as a little celebration of a little milestone. Not a bad model for less than £1 of resin, currency not weight, and 3 evenings painting. As always, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions for future videos, I'd love to hear them down in the comment section below, and I'll see you all next time.